Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be looking into and exploring a Far Cry 4 and 2 theory. That theory being, is Longinus a reborn Prosper Kouassi? Well, let's find out.
Go on, tell him.
We'll be starting off with a simplified overview of the interactions and missions between Prosper Kouassi and the player in Far Cry 2. We'll then be repeating the same process for Far Cry 4 with Ajay and Longinus.
Now go!
Let's get this train rolling, starting off with Far Cry 2. Prosper Kouassi is a former gang leader and the current captain of the APR branch within the Northern Territory, Liboasako. Upon meeting him, he claims that the APR is the greatest faction in all the land and you're lucky to be with them, all while waving a loaded gun around. Or alternatively, he will question who you are and pretend to be tough, only to be like, lol, I'm Prosper Kouassi. Everyone knows me.
I'm the famous Prosper Kouassi. You good with the gun?
Once introductions are done, business starts immediately. Prosper Kouassi then proceeds to hire and pay you upfront to assassinate the chief of police because he is corrupt and accepting bribes from the APR.
I am your boss and you will do what I say, or I will bring shame on you and your family.
Once that mission's complete, he then hires you to blow up a UFLL natural gas tanker and the natural gas cars accompanying it because they blackmailed the West into supplying them.
So rude.
And the last mission is to destroy a UFLL mortar pool by any means necessary. Explosions are encouraged.
Today I'm being paid to blow things up.
After Prosper Kouassi's last mission is completed, his UFLL rival, Dr. Leon Gakumba, will hire you to assassinate Prosper Kouassi at Goka Falls, thus ending his story because you kill him. This only occurs if you prioritize APR missions over UFLL missions though. On the flip side, if you prioritize UFLL missions, Prosper Kouassi will ask you to assassinate Dr. Leon Gakumba at Goka Falls instead.
Killjoy.
And once the job is done, he'll betray you via sending a squad of men to kill you. And once you inevitably survive, your next mission is to kill Prosper Kouassi during his victory speech. So he dies either way.
It's going to be king.
While in Far Cry 4, Longinus is one of the weapon suppliers of the Golden Path, and is also known to be a little
crazy, but if you want guns, he's the man you should see.
Upon meeting Ajay, Longinus gleefully introduces himself and welcomes him to his church away from church, all while waving a loaded gun at him, just like Prosper Kouassi did in Far Cry 2. After a few Bible passages, theorizing what gun Jesus would use, and another Bible passage, he then starts business. Longinus offers Ajay guns as payment for liberating radio towers under Pagan Min's influence, who so happens to be a corrupted warlord, at least from Longinus's perspective.
And for every radio tower that you free from pagans' lies, I will give you something. A reward.
In the next encounter, Longinus gives Ajay a GPS for the purpose of tracking and retrieving blood diamonds for him, without directly telling Ajay why until he delivers them to him. The reasoning is that each blood diamond represents a sin from his past, and he's hunting down the same blood diamonds he sold during his time in the UAC, because he wants to repent for his sins.
These are remnants of my past transgressions. Each diamond is a sin, and my hands have committed many.
As for the third, fourth, and fifth encounters, he hires Ajay to secretly follow Pagan's men to 3 different guarded vaults where you can obtain more blood diamonds. The last mission is the same. Follow one of Pagan's men to a vault, enter the vault, steal the blood diamond. However, this time, when Ajay returns, Longinus thanks him.
Thank you, AJ. Thank you.
As he leaves, he gifts Ajay with a super OP hybrid of a mortar and a rocket launcher. It really feels like you're calling the wrath of God down when you shoot this bad boy. And that wraps up our overly simplified overview of the interactions and missions for both Prosper Kouassi and Longinus. Now, let's review a few things that Longinus says that can be tracked back to Far Cry 2. And after we're done with this section, we'll be moving on to appearances and common behaviors. Let's get into it. The second time when Ajay meets with Longinus, Longinus suggests they should work together and gives Ajay a GPS for the purpose of tracking blood diamonds, almost like the one in Far Cry 2. The only issue is that many of the buttons are missing. the color is different and the nav button is in the top left instead of the bottom right. These inconsistencies, however, don't disprove that it's not related to Far Cry 2. It's most likely a newer model, but at the same time, it's suspiciously convenient and similar.
Amen.
Amen.
Let's look at our next example. Upon returning with the first batch of blood diamonds, Longinus quotes,
"And it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment."
He then explains that he was saved by a bullet to the head, which killed the past version of himself, who was a warlord, and how he was baptized by the waters of Goka Falls. I know what you're thinking. This is a direct callback to what happens at Prosper Kouassi, or Dr. Leon Gakumba, depending on which faction you side with at the end of Far Cry 2. And it's honestly an oddly specific place to be shot in the head. With that being said, I want you to take this into consideration. Longinus tends to speak through quotes and symbolism. The baptism itself may not be literal, but instead symbolic.
Leviticus 17:11. For it is the blood that makes an atonement for the soul.
Or, bear with me for a moment, the UFLL assassins who were hired to kill you once Prosper Kouassi was assassinated could have thrown his body off the bridge into the waters, thus baptizing him as he hit the water. He'd still have the hole in his head from the bullet, and the water would enter it. The fall itself is survivable, and the river stream leads to Pala. Sure, it's unlikely he'd float there, especially if he's unconscious, but if anything, there's land around him. He could wash up on shore without much problem, and as a side note, the player has survived worse. I do, however, think the former is more plausible than the latter. Overall, Longinus' description does match what happens to Prosper Kouassi in Far Cry 2, unless you end up being hired by Prosper Kouassi to kill Dr. Leon Gakumba, right?
You come back when you're done. We'll have a drink to celebrate.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
The APR has launched a massive offensive in Northern District, and the word is, you were meant to be their first target.
Well, that's a question we'll be looking into at the end of this video, but for now, let's move on to our next point. During the sixth and final meeting, Longinus, while intoxicated, confesses to 2 of his sins, using 2 blood diamonds as representations of his sins.
This one wanted travel documents to take his family someplace safe. And this one wanted malaria medicine for his sick child, and he tried to kill me for it. I cannot blame him.
Well now. It turns out that in Far Cry 2, Father Malia gives you a mission to go deliver travel documents to some underground faction citizens who are trapped within their homes. And as for the malaria medication, there is a man who shares some of his daughter's malaria medication in exchange for travel documents too. Think about it. The reason why they lock themselves up is because they don't want to fight for either of the factions, and trying to escape will result in them being shot. To add to that, almost all NPCs outside of towns like Pala are hostile. So, should we believe that someone like Prosper Kouassi or the past version of Longinus would kill someone like that? Although Dr. Leon Gakumba isn't any better, he also enforces killing people who refuse to enlist within his faction.
They are the enemy, as surely as the APR was.
This also brings up another point. What if Longinus is actually Dr. Leon Gakumba? To answer that, let's transition into our next category, appearance. Here are some side images of Dr. Leon Gakumba and Longinus. The first feature we notice about Dr. Leon Gakumba is that his right eye is blind, and that there's a visible scar stretching from underneath his right eye to the arc of his right eyebrow. Other notable features are his puffy lower eyelid creases, his high eyebrow arches, the large crease at the top of his nose bridge, and the distinct crease near his right eyebrow. Yeah, as you can see, they look nothing alike. Longinus, however, does share some features with Prosper Kouassi. The most similar feature is their eyebrows and eyes. Both of them have pretty straight eyebrows with a slight arch. Their eyes are roughly in the same shape. Other notable features are their nose shapes, lengths, and widths. Albeit in this case, Longinus has a slightly thicker nose tip, his nostrils flare out a little more, and he has freckles spotted around his nose and cheeks. Other notable features are the high-set cheekbones, which align with the middle of their noses, angular jaws, although Longinus has a slightly thicker one, most likely due to his old age, and lastly, a similar chin shape. That's a lot of similarities, despite the graphical differences in these games. Now, before we move on to behaviors, there is one huge inconsistency when it comes to appearance. That being that Longinus is 50 years old by the events of Far Cry 4, which take place during 2014 according to the Far Cry wiki, while Far Cry 2 supposedly takes place during 2008, meaning Longinus would have to be 44 years old during that game. The problem here is that Prosper Kouassi looks like he's in his early 30s to mid 30s, and if anything, maybe maximum 40s, but that's really pushing it. I'm not sure if this age gap is intentional or not, or if I'm reading the age incorrectly. It could also mean by 2021 Longinus is 50 years old. That would mean by 2014, aka during the events of Far Cry 4, he'd be 43 years old, which is still plausible. And by using our super cool math skills, by 2008, during the events of Far Cry 2, he would be 37 years old, which could work. It's not enough to completely disprove the theory outright, but it's definitely put a dent in it. Last point on this subject before we move on, Longinus doesn't seem to have a birthday, so this point is highly debatable, at least until Ubisoft confirms his birth year. And if I'm wrong on this, and he does have a canonical birthday, or year, please correct me in the comments. Next up is behaviors. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Remember when we met Prosper Kouassi and how he was swinging and pointing his loaded gun at you? Well, turns out that habit is shared by Longinus, who also upon meeting swings around and points a loaded gun at you. Casually, might I add. This could be a coincidence, but I really don't think so. It's too specific, and from my knowledge, there is no other Far Cry character who casually waves a gun at you when speaking. Not even Voss does that, and he is pretty insane.
Why aren't you laughing now like you did up there? What, is this not fun anymore? Have I failed to entertain you?
The only people that share this behavior are Prosper Kouassi and Longinus. Here's our next example. They both deal in blood diamonds. Prosper Kouassi used blood diamonds to pay off mercenaries to do work for him, while Longinus accepts blood diamonds as payment for weapon shipments to the Golden Path. This is a decent point, but trading blood diamonds is common throughout the UAC, so it's not exclusive, and it doesn't necessarily tie Prosper Kouassi to Longinus, unlike their love for casually waving guns at people.
Bam.
But there are no empty words for you, but your very life.
Here's another example. Both use violence to justify their means. Prosper Kouassi uses it to promote his values for freedom and for the APR ideology in Far Cry 2, while Longinus uses it to free the people of Karat from Pagan's influence through Ajay's actions, to atone for his past sins via collecting blood diamonds he sold in the past, and to bring justice to evildoers in the name of God. The only overlap I see here is a desire to use violence, usually through others, to promote freedom, but also punish those who disagree with their versions of freedom. So it's not actually about freedom, it's about their perspective of freedom that ties them together. This also applies to Dr. Leon Gakumba though. However, he's more about tradition, UFLL pride, and keeping the status quo, while both Longinus and Prosper Kouassi are about change with a dash of chaos. So it's not exclusive to both of them, but it's definitely notable. We've made it to our last example. It will be an examination of their speech patterns and body language. First, let's look at how they express themselves. Prosper Kouassi is quite dramatic in his speech whenever it's positive.
This is the APR. Greatest faction in the land.
Or negative.
You good with the gun? You think you can hit a guy in a fast car?
It's a big target, it'll be easy to hit.
Is Kouassi talking to you, Camper? No.
Rarely does he speak casually. It's always either dramatic or emotional.
Chief of Police. Bam. Oh, look who's here. The guy who works with everybody. Well, that's about to end.
Longinus also shares this similar speech pattern, although his is almost theatrical in a way. I think this exaggeration is a side effect from being shot in the head. After all, the bullet did pierce his skull and most likely damage his prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for things like decision making, emotional regulation, problem solving, and self-control.
And the Lord said, "Who shall I send?" And you answered, saying, "I am here, send me." I come from a land of death and misery, and I stood with the devil for so long. Who shall I sing? And I said, I am here, send me.
Another factor that can be observed through their speech patterns is how they speak through symbolism.
That little penis will be in a great big SUV.
Start by finding a lost sheep.
They are not like you. They are bugs compared to you.
Guns, AJ! Guns! Without them, how else will we pass through the sea of trouble and calm the surging tides?
Better than with those old ladies in the United Front.
each diamond is a sin. And my hands have committed many.
The only issue here is that Prosper Kouassi doesn't have too much screen time. His meetings are much briefer than Longinus's. He's also a lot more mentally stable, so his symbolism is a lot more controlled, but present nevertheless. Here's a bonus factor. Both pay you before you do any work since they have good feelings about you.
I've got a good feeling about this. How about we pay you right now for the work, hmm?
Prosper Kouassi has Kwepo give you diamonds up front, and Longinus gives you an SMG. As for body language, it's self-explanatory. Neither of these men have the ability to sit still, need to wave their arms around, and are constantly changing their facial animations.
Welcome to my church! Away from church!
Kenwan's trains are gone, hey? No more medicine. Too bad. So sad.
Rejoice with me, for I have found my lost sheep.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps up our full analysis of this theory. So, is Prosper Kouassi Longinus? I'm not gonna lie, I originally thought that this theory was bullshit, and my intention was to disprove it, but in doing so, I ended up changing my stance. So yes, I do think Prosper Kouassi is a born-again Longinus. There are way too many factors and coincidences that overlap. But before we end this video, there are two counter-arguments we have against this theory. The first being the age problem, which is highly debatable, mainly because we don't actually have the birth date for Prosper Kouassi and Longinus. And as for the second argument, it's a situation where you kill Prosper Kouassi at the rally instead of Goka Falls, which could be argued as non-canon. Here's the problem with that. There isn't a confirmed canon for Far Cry 2 because it's meant to be a non-linear game, but at the same time, it's still connected to Far Cry 4, meaning there needs to be a canon choice between Prosper Kouassi and Dr. Leon Gakumba. One of them has to die at Goka Falls, and the other needs to die at the Victory Speech Rally. See the problem here? This argument has no answers, thus is open to interpretation. And that's all she wrote, folks. If you enjoyed this analysis, feel free to leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that fun YouTube stuff. And if you agree or disagree, please do leave your comments. I'm curious to hear your perspective on this theory. If you want more theory videos, please let me know. And lastly, I'll be returning back to my MBTI analysis videos. I'm going to start a new series on Far Cry 4 and then move on to Far Cry 6. Have a wonderful evening, a glorious day, and a fantastic night. Ciao, ciao, everyone.